All right. So it's a real shame that we couldn't draw a crowd to Claudia's talk today. I'm really bummed by that. Welcome to this joint event between the Economic History Workshop and the Center on Global Poverty and Development Speaker Series. I'm Ran Abramitsky, an associate professor at the Economics Department and an affiliate of the center. And I would first like to thank Grant Miller, the director of the center, for sponsoring this event and for his and the center's efforts to foster discussion between distinguished scholars, policymakers, and the Stanford community at large. I would also especially like to thank Jessica Leino and especially Alexandra Lizonek for making this event happen. And tonight we are very excited to welcome Claudia Goldin, the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Claudia was the director of the NBER's development of the American Economy Program for 20 years. She's a former president of the American Economic Association, a former president of the Economic History Association, and a former editor of the Journal of Economic History. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Econometric Society. Claudia is an economic historian and a labor economist. Her historical work on women in the US labor force is path-breaking. And she has written 9 books and dozens of articles and made real big progress on a wide range of topics, including female labor force, immigration, inequality, technological change, and the gender earnings gap. Now, I always give Claudia's research as Exhibit A for how studying the past has been useful for understanding the present. Claudia's research beautifully interprets the present through the lens of the past and explores the origins of current issues of concern. And so her latest project, which we will discuss today, A Long Road, The Quest of Career and Family, which focuses on college women's achievement of career and family, is what she will discuss today. And please join me in welcoming Claudia.
Thanks very much. Okay. So I'm going to be speaking today about the last 2 chapters of a book in progress. And it's very much in progress. It's called A Long Road. And it's a good title for any book because all books are a long road. As all of you know, sometimes it has an end. And it's The Quest for Career and Family. So The Long Road, as this book, concerns the evolution of college graduate women's aspirations and achievements. And so we are now nearing the culmination of this road that has led to the ability of women to have a career and a family. And as we approach the end of this road, we can clearly see that equity in the labor market for women means equity at home for couples. I just want to ask, is this microphone acting strange? Because it sounds really strange to me. It isn't acting strange? It seems fine? Okay. It's like when you talk on the phone to someone and you hear feedback and you think, is it me? Okay. Well, I'll put it this way. You are my audience, so whatever is good for you is fine for me. Okay. So let me go back to the point that I just made, that we can see clearly now that equity in the labor market for women, what we see on the front pages of many of our papers, that we want gender equality, that we can see now that this is more than that. It means equity at home for couples. Let me explain a bit. And the reason why the gender gap still exists in earnings, and also why there has been in the US 2 decades of stagnation in women's labor force participation, at least at mid-age, not for older women, at mid-age. The reason for these 2 is also why attaining what I'll call couple equity, and that doesn't mean the house, couple equity, is so difficult. They are the flip sides, the 2 sides of the same exact issue. If one member of a couple, generally the male, takes the higher paying, less flexible job, that is the one with the less control over at-call hours, for example. And the other, generally the female, takes the lower paying, more flexible job, the one that has more control. Both a gender earnings gap and a couple inequity will result. They are the same, the two sides of the same precise issue. But much will depend upon the cost and thus the price of flexibility. Another way of putting that is control over hours. So that's what I'm going to be discussing today. But first, a few words about the book in progress. Now, I don't have time to tell you much about the book other than the 2 chapters I'm going to be discussing at the end. But one chapter provides some very important background information for what I have to say, and that's chapter 3. And chapter 3 sets forth the evolution of career and family that took place over the past 100 or so years across 5 cohorts. And the 5 cohorts are divided by some meaningful ways that I do not have time to discuss right now. So the first cohort, you can see when it's born, had either family or career. In fact, in this first cohort, 50% of the female graduates never had kids and 30% never married. It then shifts into what I call cohort 2, and that cohort is born between around 1900 and the end of World War I. And that then shifts into cohort 3 that had family then job. This is peak baby boom, very low age at first marriage, very high fraction marrying. So it had family came first and then came job. And that then switched very suddenly to cohort 4, which started marrying much later, started having kids a lot later, putting career first and then family. A very large fraction of that group, we'll see, never had kids. And that then switched to the current cohort that I can follow until their 40s, cohort 5, that has said, we're not going to put one first or the other first, we are going to have both. Now, in terms of real people, 2 members of Congress are the bookends of this set of cohorts, beginning with Jeannette Rankin, the first woman to be elected to Congress. She was there and voted for the 19th Amendment. She also voted against entering World War I. She also voted against entering World War II. She's an interesting person. But she was typical of her generation. She never married, never had kids. And fast forward to the other side of the book shelf here, the other bookend, and that's Tammy Duckworth, recently elected senator from Illinois, was congresswoman from Illinois, and also the first woman to bring a baby into the House, into Congress. She brought, this is her, with her baby, well, this is her, not with the baby, but with her first child. The baby was born about 2 weeks ago. And in the middle of this road is Betty Friedan, and I will say a couple of words about taking issue in my book with parts of The Feminine Mystique, which is really hard to do because The Feminine Mystique sold millions and millions of copies, and we're still reading it. So how is it possible that I have found something wrong with it? Well, we'll see. The book uses a lot of sources that are well known. I won't go through them. They're here. Many of you in the room know these sources well. But the book also uses a host of unusual sources, some of which I have found and can use because, for example, one called Great Aspirations, which was collected by Nork in 1961, is a gigantic survey for the time. For us, it's like 35,000, whoa. But they couldn't analyze it because it was 35,000. So they could only analyze a tiny little subset of 3,000, and then they stopped analyzing the resurveys. I found it, put it up, and now we can see exactly what the responses were for the entire survey. That also, and surveys like collections like Notable American Women, Marquise Who's Who, Women's Bureau bulletins that I found the original data in the National Archives and so on. So there's a lot new, interesting information about the stated aspirations and hopes of college men and women just as they're exiting college and 3 and 7 years after. So there's a lot of interesting new material. And what I'm going to do today, though, is talk less about that material than about part 4, the end of the road. How to achieve gender equity is my subject for today. Okay. So most college graduate women today want a career and a family. But the twin goals compete in more people's lives than ever before. And I put it that way, they compete in our lives, but they've always competed in our lives, in the lives of people who want a career and a family for women. But the reason that these issues are of even more importance today is that they compete in a very large fraction of women's and men's and couples' lives. And there are 3 reasons why that's the case. The first one is that there are simply more college graduate women than ever before. That makes sense. In fact, the fraction who will ever graduate from a 4-year college, and of course, as we all know, there is no such thing as a 4-year college anymore, since the majority of people graduating from 4-year colleges do it in 5 years. But the fraction who will ever graduate from what we call a 4-year college is now about 45% for women, and it's about 36% for men. So that's the first one, a lot more college graduates. The second one is that more college graduate women have serious career ambitions than ever before. Almost a quarter of women recently awarded a BA, and almost 30% of men, and you can see that the female number is increasing and the male number is pretty stable, that about a quarter of the women have successfully pursued among the highest advanced professional degrees. And finally, and this is the surprise, so we have more college graduate women, more pursuing advanced degrees. What about the family part? And the family part is the surprise, because as you can see here, the fraction who, and this is the fraction with no births, and this is birth year on the horizontal axis. So I said before that we have various cohorts, and cohort 4 begins around here. So this is cohort 4, and then cohort 5 is this one over here. So cohort 4 was the cohort that said, gosh, armed with this birth control pill, I can delay marriage and I can delay having kids without giving up on all these other fun things. And I can go out and I can invest in my career and in more education. And then I'll have the kids later, because after all, the cohort that preceded me showed me that having kids was like really easy. And you can see that the fraction who at the end of the day, and the end of their days when they're about in their 40s, almost at the peak here, it's about 27%. This is from the CPS June fertility supplement. So it's over 25% of all college graduate women, all, not just the ones that went for advanced degrees, did not have a first birth by the time they were 40 to 44. But then there was a big turnaround. The numbers for here were widely discussed. What hasn't been discussed, except for the fact that Pew wrote a report on it recently. What hasn't been discussed is that, in fact, the numbers have declined. That is, the fraction of college graduate women who have kids has increased. And just about anyone who's been at a university knows that assistant professor women have kids now, whereas 30 years ago, assistant professor women did not. So there are these three reasons that this is a bigger issue now than ever before. Now, many people believe that the twin goals of career and family can be furthered through various fixes. So the first one that lots of people think would work, and perhaps some of it does, is fix the women. And you fix the women by improving their bargaining skills, just make them more competitive, and things will get better. Create greater pay transparency, that too could do something. The second one is, well, we're going to fix the infants. The infants are a real problem. So we're going to expand protected and paid family leave. Expanding childcare might be better, but no one's talking much about that. The third one is, well, let's fix the daddies, and fix the daddies by changing social norms. That would be really, really good, and there are some countries that are trying to do that. And the final one is, well, the real problem, some people say, is in the labor market, so let's fix the managers by making them less biased. And these policies, and they are real policies, and they address what I refer to as the low-hanging fruit. And I say if the low-hanging fruit is cheap to pick, go where marginal cost equals marginal benefit, so go pick the low-hanging fruit. But I don't think that that's going to really close the gender earnings gap or do a tremendous amount to address the issue of couple equity unless the costs of what I call temporal flexibility are reduced. Now, by temporal flexibility, and by that I really mean control over hours, I mean it's an amenity that allows employees to work particular hours and not get penalized, or to work fewer days per week or fewer hours per day and not get penalized on a per hour basis. Okay? But the cost to firms of the amenity is really critical. If the amenity is expensive, then the costs are going to be imposed on those who take it. So, for example, if there are two kinds of people, some of whom can only work if the air is clean, and some of whom don't really care if the air is clean, then firms will provide clean air at some expense, and the ones who want to enjoy the clean air will have lower earnings because of that. So that's the type of amenity that I'm thinking of, and there are various ways to equalize the earnings of the people who like the clean air and the ones who don't give a damn about it. And one way is that the firms will want to conserve on the costs of cleaning the air, and there'll be better technologies and cheaper technologies to do that. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of the compensating equilibria and the fact that the costs can be, and we'll see in certain cases, reduced. So I've raised a difficult problem, and there's one for which there's no one-fits-all solution. I often get questions and calls, and people stop me and say, "What's your solution?" And I always say, I don't have a solution, okay? But I do know that there are places in which it has been done. So the landscape is not that bleak. There are firms and occupations that have reduced the cost of temporal flexibility, and many are in today's growth sectors, such as in tech and in health and in science. So some of the ways in which occupations and firms have succeeded in reducing the costs include the following. So one is improving the ability of employees to be better puzzle pieces for each other. In fact, all you need is another person to be your double. And you can, if you have to take your mom to the dentist on Friday at 11 o'clock and some client is coming and wants you to be the person there, you just say, I'll just get my double to sit in for me. My double knows everything I know, looks like me, sounds like me. So how might you do that? Well, convey information using IT with really little loss in fidelity, and also create effective teams of substitutes. The worst thing is having teams of complements, because if there's a group of 32 people who have to meet at 11 o'clock on Friday, you're going to have real problems, and we all know that to be the case. But I remember one day I received a note from my personal bank, Bank of America, I'm sure none of you know what it is, that said, congratulations, you now have, rather than having one personal banker, who I didn't even know I had, you have a team of personal bankers. Well, that was really good for Bank of America to do, because now I wouldn't put excessive demands on Tom, who is supposed to be my personal banker. So that's creating teams of substitutes. Now, these will reduce the amenity cost and create pay that is more linear with respect to hours. So the cheaper is the amenity, the more linear pay is. That is, if you work 60 hours a week, you should get double what a person who works 30 hours a week gets, not 3 times or 4 times. So how do we know that temporal flexibility matters to whether gender equity can be achieved? So I'm going to provide a little bit of evidence on this. So the first thing is that the gender earnings gap greatly increases with age. It's often the case that a journalist will call me, or a policy person will speak to me and say, what is the gender gap? It's 20 cents on the dollar. So what does that mean? And my answer is always to explain that it's the measure at the median for full-time workers. It's a ratio or a log difference. And then they glaze over. And then I say, but that isn't the point. It's not a single number. It changes over time. You know, that's just the average at the median for full-time workers. And the important thing is that it does change a lot over time. And the largest widening is at the moment of family formation. And we know that from really good data sets. This is just using the census and the ACS with a bunch of controls. Now, in using better data sets, and this is using the LEHD and the 2000 census and some work I did with some colleagues, we also see that the widening, and this is the raw data, the widening, so the what we do with each of these individuals is we find them when they've just finished their education. So for college graduates, it'll be, let's say, we'll start them at about age 24 or 25. For the less than high school grads, we'll start them at about 20. And then we follow them through this period. And we see what's happening to their earnings. And you can see that for college grads, the gap begins smaller, but it widens enormously. And for the others, particularly for the less than high school grads, it doesn't go anywhere. We can add in controls for industry and occupation, and we can see that women are going disproportionately into the lower earnings industries, and we can also see, holding firms constant, that they're going into the lower wage firms as well, and then the residual here is what's happening within the firms. Now, as many as you know, similar findings, and even more interesting, come from administrative data in Sweden and in Denmark, using birth events to see what happens to male and female earnings, in particular for a couple after a birth event. And you can see that the gender earnings gap widens enormously then. The gap also differs by occupational group, and adjusted for various characteristics, most importantly, hours of work, gender earnings differences are strongly related to occupational characteristics, I'll show you, that concern temporal flexibility, such as the need for face time, for on-call hours, and other time demands. So what I'm going to do here, and this comes from a lecture I gave a while back. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this graph, and on the horizontal axis is the log of male income per year, annual income. So, and this axis over here is the gender earnings gap. And I'm going to populate this with dots for each of the occupations in the census, okay? And so I'm going to first compute the gender earnings gap by occupation from just a big regression of full-time, full-year, 25 to 64 years old, including a bunch of covariates, hours, weeks, education, and so on. And I'm going to look here only at the top paying occupations. So it's everyone above a level of about $60,000 a year. And this is what I've come up with, okay? And the squares here are, the red squares are business and finance occupations, and the diamonds are tech occupations, not necessarily tech sector. Tech, as you know, is all over. In fact, it's even in this room. So you don't have to be in Google to be in tech. Other diamonds here are in, other triangles, I should say, are in science. What I want you to see is that the squares and most of the diamonds are health occupations, are generally below, that is, they have the largest gender gaps. So that, if you may recall, this is mapped into 1, 90%, 82, and so on. And they generally have really large gender gaps, and the other ones have much smaller ones. There's another revealing way to present exactly the same data, and that is that I create two groups from these occupations. One is business and finance, and I have something else that will show you. Some people like to see some names that go with these occupations, so you can see that that these are the engineers and the, so engineers over here, probably the standard error up here is very big. I didn't draw in standard errors, but it's not like women in atmospheric and space science, or, you know, that there's something that we should go to those. This is what journalists always ask, you know, what's going on in that diamond? You know, let's go there and find out what are they doing right, okay? I don't think I really should put in standard errors here. And you can see that down here are, in terms of the health professions, these are all the ones with a lot of more ownership, self-employment, okay? The podiatrists, okay? I had foot surgery recently. I love podiatrists. I don't want to say anything bad about them, but they're a bunch of guys and they make a lot of money, okay? But here I will talk about pharmacists, one of my favorite occupations, okay? So that just gives you a sense of what it looks like. But I was going to tell you that I'm going to redo that in a way that makes it look really interesting. And so think of this, what I'm going to do here is these are still the earnings gaps here. And this axis is nothing. It's just all the different occupations. Rather than putting bars, I'm going to put dots. This is always very confusing. I always say then there's always someone in the room who then stops me afterwards and says, what's on that axis? You know, it's just a count, okay? So these are the squares. Remember, the squares are the finance ones, the corporate ones, and also my podiatrist is in here somewhere. And so it just goes from lowest to highest. So lowest is the biggest gap, this is the highest. And then these are the diamonds, and these are the science and tech and health that it doesn't have high self-ownership, okay? So, so they're just ordered in ascending order of the ratio of female to male earnings. Okay. So astoundingly, only 6 of the business and finance occupations have a gender earnings ratio that exceeds the lowest in the science and technology. That's these people over here, and you can see who they are. The mean differences are pretty large. It's about 70. So this is correcting for a lot of different things. So it's about 0.79 for the squares, and it's about 0.9 for the triangles. So now the reasons, now we want to know, well, why are they different? And one way of exploring this that I came up with is to look at ONET. So ONET, many of you have looked at ONET, and you know how much fun it is to look at ONET. And you can see in the Department of Labor's Occupational Information Network that every occupation has tons and tons of different skill demands, okay? So people lift things, lift heavy things, light things. People have to be nice to each other. People have to converse with each other. And so I picked 5 of them that seemed to fit what I was interested in. How much time pressure is there? How much contact with others? Do you have to establish and maintain interpersonal relationships? Do you have to make decisions very frequently? Do you have a structured work or not? And so I just added these together. I summed them after picking these 5. I normalized the 5 characteristics. I summed them to form an aggregate measure. A higher value means more of these time demands, more face time, more on-call, and lower means less. Okay? And then I just took the data that I had before. So on this axis here is that normalized score from these characteristics, and this over here is just my gender earnings gap that I got from the other regression. And as you can see, there's a pretty clear relationship, causal, we don't know, it's a pretty clear relationship between the ONET characteristics and the gender earnings gap. And it's a pretty large effect. You know, if it were causal, we could eliminate 50% of the gender earnings gap. If we could only make the finance people into tech people or into scientists, okay? So what then can alter the characteristics? And for this, let me just give you a couple of examples and wrap up. So the occupation of pharmacist is a good example. First of all, I want you all, the next time you go into the pharmacy, and I don't know what pharmacies you have here, we have CVS. So next time you go into the CVS, just look at the pharmacist and salute, okay? First of all, these are really high-income people. You didn't know that, but they are. It's the 8th highest annual income for full-time men and the 3rd highest for women. So if you're thinking about if you have kids of the age where they're going off to college, just say pharmacy. Okay, now one of the problems in saying pharmacy, it's like in the graduate plastics, is that you have to go to a school where they teach pharmacy, okay? And they don't teach pharmacy in lots of schools. So that may be a reason why these people are so highly paid, but that's a whole other story, okay? Now, female pharmacists today earn about 90% what male pharmacists earn on an hourly basis, but it wasn't always that way. So you can see here, this over here gives us historically what female to male median annual earnings are for pharmacists. This here is the fraction who work in independent pharmacies. So some of you may recall long ago, go back long ago, you went to the pharmacy, you didn't go to CVS. You went to a small independent-owned pharmacy, and there'd be a guy who was Mr. Pharmacist, Mr. Smith, the pharmacist, and he would have an assistant who was a woman, and she was working part-time, and she got a pittance what he got because he was the residual claimant. And we can see that the fraction female among pharmacists has grown a lot. So the question is, what accounts for the increase in female to male earnings in pharmacy and for the low gender gaps in pharmacies today? So part of it is that part-time work is extensive in pharmacy, particularly for women. So this is the fraction working part-time. And yet, in estimates that I've done using usual data and using unusual data from surveys of pharmacists, there is almost no part-time penalty in pharmacy. Pharmacists today who work more hours earn more in an almost linear fashion. They are perfect puzzle pieces for each other. Information is transferred from one to the other with little loss in fidelity. You do not go to a pharmacist usually and say, "You? I don't recognize you. I want so-and-so to fill my prescription." So you might say, how did this come about? Well, it came about because of three rather unrelated reasons. One is that there was more standardized drugs. The second one is that there is simply a really effective use of information technology that's increased the substitutability, that's made them into very good puzzle pieces. And the third, which is sort of an irony, is the increased corporate ownership. That in this case, as in the case of dentists, as in the case of veterinarians, as in the case of physicians, corporate ownership vastly reduced the gender earnings gap because it vastly reduced the fraction here of pharmacists that earn rents by being the residual claimant. It's taking all of the time that would be needed to run the pharmacy and putting it into the hands of management, okay? Examples of other occupations abound in terms of being successful in reducing the cost of substituting across employees. They include anesthesiologists that work in teams. They include obstetricians that work in teams because one obstetrician cannot have two women in labor at exactly the same time, although that probably could be done, but it generally isn't. Two very interesting cases are veterinarians. So it used to be that if Muffy, that's your cat, by the way, got sick at 2 in the morning, Muffy always gets sick at 2 in the morning, right? Yeah? Then you would have to go to a local clinic, and you would have to wake up the veterinarian, okay? And then in the 70s and the 80s, regional hospitals began. The veterinarians, in fact, created them. They're called referral hospitals. And many of them are still called referral hospitals, even though they're just hospitals. And it's the same thing with people. When you get sick, you go to the emergency room at 2 in the morning. You don't call up your doctor, at least I don't. So veterinarians are moving in the right direction. Also, there's been a lot of, today, 77% of all veterinary graduates are women, and they're not wanting to purchase all these small veterinary clinics for some obvious reasons, and so corporate ownership is moving into veterinary work as well. And the final one are hospitalists, and anyone who's been to a hospital in the last couple of years has met a hospitalist, and those of you who haven't are saying to yourselves, what the heck is a hospitalist? So the hospitalist is a subspecialty of internal medicine, is an individual who is in the hospital, has 20-something patients, and conserves on the time of the primary care provider physician and takes care of all of these patients. So there are lots of ways in which firms are trying to conserve on these costs, okay? So let me conclude. So how can we achieve gender equity? And so it's not just going to be a change in company policy. I always get questions, well, why don't we just pass a law that changes these hours and things? That's not going to work, okay? It's going to have to be more of a restructuring of jobs that do what I have said. In the end, sort of create more linearity. But this is not a zero-sum game. So gender equity is not just about women. Men being on call at work and women being on call at home is not equitable for couples. So the larger these gaps, so if there are two jobs and one of them is flexible and one of them is inflexible, and women disproportionately take the flexible one, if that gap, if the cost of flexibility is a lot, let's say it's $50K a year, couples, even the couples who want equity at home, don't want to leave $50,000 sitting on the floor every year, okay? The smaller that is, if it's $5,000, well, okay, equity at home is worth $5,000. So if flexibility is an expensive amenity, couples have to pay a lot for couple equity. So thank you very much. Yes, Caroline.
So I have a quick fact for you that you'll enjoy, I think. Right? And then I have an economics question. So the fact is, I have very recent paper that looks at returns to different college majors. And even if you are comparing a man and a woman who have exactly the same SAT scores and high school grades, who go to the same college and are in the same major, same cohort, everything else the same, there's still about a 20% pay gap on average. I was totally shocked by that because I thought more of it would be coming from the between, the men are all becoming engineers, the women are all becoming education majors or something like that. So it's just
No, you knew that was no longer the same.
well, okay, but fun fact. Okay. And it's not from aptitude differences either.
Right.
So these are students who are exactly the same in
Right.
math and verbal skills. Then the question I wanted to ask you is, I teach public economics, and one of the things that we think about each year when we think about optimal taxation is what characteristics should we tag? In other words, what characteristics should cause us to vary tax rates by individual? And one of the arguments is that women should have a tag such that they are charged lower marginal tax rates because they are inherently or biologically the people who are going to be taking more time off when babies are born. And there's a nice paper by our colleague Alberto Alesina and Andrea Aquino on this topic, and I wondered whether you could talk about whether you think that's good economics or not.
Maybe good economics, but I would much rather that we didn't take that as a given. So it would be perfectly okay if it were a given. If women had 3 ears and they had to clean out more ears, we might want to give them a tax break on something, okay? Or if they had some other type of disability. But I don't think that this is a case in which I think that I'd much rather do something that incentivized men to take care of their kids more. So, and we know that there are countries that are doing that, and even Britain is trying to move in the direction of incentivizing. And the problem there, so the question is, what is the failure? And I think the failure there has to do with being first mover in a firm or as a worker. So if none of the men are taking the time off, and we saw this in Sweden, so none of the men were, even if they had the ability to do it, were taking the time off. And none of them wanted to be viewed as, oh, you're the lemon. You're the one who isn't any good. And so it just took getting over that hump. It took having enormous incentives saying, if you don't use this, you lose it, and having enough of them do it. So I would much rather go in that direction. Yeah. Do I call the shots here? Okay, back there.
So the lessons you draw from the pharmacy example is that kind of job redesign and industrial structural change can be great for gender equity. But I'm wondering, if you think about what actually happened and your explanation for it, which is that all the management functions got taken away and put up to a kind of company management, is it not potentially the case that in fact there's just as much inequity, it's just there's now one man being paid all of the rents, whereas before there were all the men getting paid all the rents. And if that's true, do we say it's fine because per person, sort of the number of people, most people are such that men and women are equal. There's just this one man who's really bad, who's got all the money. Or do we think about it differently?
I think that what you're doing, and I think it's a very, very good thing to do, is to think harder about where are these functions going. So these are simply, great big principal agent problems and the problem of not being able to fully contract out. And so the question is, and I think it's a scale issue. I think that in these pharmacies were pretty small. And so, probably today there are management companies that you could bring in to completely, the question is, could you completely contract out that so there isn't one person who's brought in to the residual claimant? But in these firms, there are gazillion residual claimants, us, we're the shareholders. But it's an interesting question to sort of follow through where these rents then are going and whether in fact there aren't any because there are just better ways of doing things that were not efficient for these small owners to do. Thank you. Oh, John. Is your name John? And I changed the date. John noticed that I had May 2nd up here, and he thought that he was here on the wrong date.
2 months ago, in Europe, an agreement was reached that allowed workers, men, women, either, temporarily or permanently, to work a 28-hour work week.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I mention it is that it was secured by Europe's largest trade union. My reading of America between 1840 and 1940 is that hours would not have been reduced without the activity of trade unions. Managers were resolutely opposed to any reduction in working hours and denied the evidence that was produced to them that shorter hours didn't have the calamitous effects that they claimed. Well, if that history is going to be repeated, the environment, you need an agent for workers, men and women, to get these more flexible and shorter hours. But the environment today in America is not conducive for unions to secure that, except, of course, for those sectors, such as teachers, where unions remain significant.
That's a lot. And that's all very interesting. Let me begin with the first one, and I'll try to be brief. So the Netherlands did that a long time ago. So the Netherlands passed, I'm sure you know about this. So the Dutch were very concerned that female labor force participation was abysmally low. It was like ridiculously low. And it was low because there's a social norm that Dutch women are to be home when their kids come home for lunch. And so the Netherlands, the Dutch government wanted to increase the fraction of women in the labor force. And they passed a law that said something about the fact that if you're working 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, you could request and be given 4 days a week, 8 hours, and have your earnings be reduced proportionally. And if you're working 4, you could ask for 3 and have your wages be reduced proportionally. Now, in the short run, it looked really good. The labor force participation rates of women shot up. You know, women didn't want to work full-time, but they would work part-time, and that's what they did. And then when it was looked longitudinally, because they have a lot of years now, they discovered that the women who were working part-time when they were young and had kids worked part-time when they were older and their kids were no longer at home asking for lunch. And of course, as we know, Dutch men and women are the tallest in the world, so something was going right there, okay? Dutch women today the average Dutch woman works about 20 hours a week. You're not going anywhere in your job when you're working 20 hours a week. So they succeeded in getting the labor force participation rate up, but hours of work are still nowhere. So the first thing is that I'm not certain that this rule is going to do anything, because what one has to do, as I said, you cannot mandate part-time work, you cannot mandate linearity. What you're going to do then is it's going to mean that any young woman who comes looking for a job is going to get a job in which it's a dead-end position, because no one's going to want to make her a partner in a firm and then have her work 18 hours a week, okay? That's the first one. The second one is an extraordinarily important point, that hours of work reduced enormously in America in 2 important periods, one around World War I and another around World War II. But of course, I don't have a good answer for this, and if I did, it would take us much too long, and I'd get into a long discussion with John. But it should be realized that when hours were reduced, they were reduced for poor people and the rich people, and we are all the rich people. Everyone today almost is a more rich person, because manufacturing is this much in the economy rather than this much in the economy, and agriculture and jobs like that are also this much. White-collar workers were always working fewer hours. But this is an interesting set of questions. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really interested in creating equity at home, and really interested in your book when it comes out. Let me propose, I think it's a thought experiment. To get really equity in the home, you have income for the male and the female is quite different. It seems to me if you want equity in the home, you should have a standard of living in that home that's double the lowest income. That's really the only way to really get true equity and have people making decisions that are really equitable for both the men and the women. As long as you're adding the two together and having a higher standard of living, you're creating such an imbalanced power structure, and you're not really making good decisions on equity. Now that's really a thought experiment, because there's no policy that can do that, but I really feel that a family that would decide to live on double the lowest income would end up with much more equitable equity at home.
Right. And without the Mercedes and things like that. Yeah. I said without the Mercedes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so that would be equity at home is expensive. That's all you're saying. Yeah. And that's what I said as well. And it depends upon people are making their own decisions. If something is expensive, we generally buy less of it. That's all. Okay. And you have a very, very fortunate spouse. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can take these two over here, since I can't make a decision between the two of them. both of them, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you look at same-sex,
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
what you can learn from it, and what are the differences?
I would love to learn a lot, and of course the data that we have are quite limited in the U.S. because we just started collecting information on same-sex couples and same-sex marriage. But that's you know, in some sense, it's sort of no different, because the only difference is that I'm not going to call one, and I tried very hard in this, not to call one a man and one a woman. In fact, you will notice my extremely androgynous people, okay? When I said fix daddy, I fixed daddy, okay? But it's going to be the same. If there are kids, then they're going to have to decide, once again, whether they should have equity at home or whether they're going to take whatever amount that they would have left on the floor and someone would take the less flexible job. So it's sort of the same, okay, if there are kids. Okay. If there aren't kids, these things generally don't matter. Taking care of home these days, as everybody knows, is just a Roomba away, okay? A Roomba and a call to, Amazon Fresh. Yeah, question?
You have looked at these issues
I'm sorry?
You have looked at this issue in a historical way, so you have a lot of knowledge about the different strategies that have been, and life experiences that women have had over time. So I was wondering whether there was at any point in time a situation where women opted to be like men. So in other words, they would choose a career, have an inflexible job, and marry someone who had a flexible job.
Right, yeah.
Is there a strategy?
There is, in Sex and the City, the lawyer who is now running for mayor of New York, right? Governor, sorry, that's right. She's running for governor. She was the only one of the four that had a real job. I don't know what the others were doing. I don't know if they eventually married, but she had a kid with the bartender, okay? So I know that, okay? Thank you.